Hi, everyone, wherever you are in the world. Good morning, good evening, whatever time of the day it is for you. Thank you so much for showing up today. This is the last webinar I'll be hosting in my capacity as current chair of the Second Language Writing Interest section of TESOL. And my name is SLWIS. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a professor at Indiana University, Indianapolis. And I'm very excited tonight to welcome David Hirsh to be our speaker. And one of the reasons why I'm excited is because we tend to talk more, maybe in our interest group, about writing with big W, conceptual process related type of writing. And his talk, I think, appeals to all of those of us who like approaching writing from that point of view, as well as to the ones who will pause and ask, well, what about, how do you teach vocabulary, right? So that's his thing, that's his topic. I will read a little bit from the short bio he sent me. David Hirsh teaches in the Masters of Education / TESOL program at the University of Sydney and supervises doctoral students in the area of second language vocabulary. He has conducted research in New Zealand, Thailand, Japan, and Australia, and has lived in Sydney since 2007. He has 2 grown children who are multilingual. His primary area of research, as I said, is about the role of vocabulary in language learning. And he has published widely on this topic. So with that, I will turn the floor to David Hirsh. Thank you very much for joining us. And there you go. It's your turn now.
Thank you, Estella, for the very warm welcome. And again, to all of you, good morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are. It's morning for me, Thursday here in Sydney. The talk today, I really appreciate the opportunity to share with you ideas about vocabulary and how it relates to second language writing. I've got a slideshow, but we can really stop this at any stage to have discussion. And I've suggested to Estella, participants could put up a hand or even interrupt me at any stage. But what I would like to do, as is customary or becoming customary in Australia at the moment, is to commence the talk or the webinar today with an acknowledgement of country. And for me, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands in which I'm broadcasting today. They are the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation of Australia. I'd like to acknowledge their culture, their knowledge systems, their belief systems, the transmission of knowledge over tens of thousands of years in Australia, but also to pay respects to the elders, past, present, and emerging. And I'd also like to acknowledge and pay respect to any First Nations people with us today. This map represents 250 of the documented languages of Indigenous Australia. So a little bit about myself and why I came to be giving the talk today in relating vocabulary with writing. So I have really been interested in second language vocabulary research now for 3 decades. It started with an interest in use of corpora to look at patterns of vocabulary use in texts. So Alice's Adventures in Wonderland is a novel, is an example of a continuous text. Continuous texts lend themselves particularly well to vocabulary development, and I think probably associated more with a reading teacher than a writing teacher, but within an extensive reading program, the opportunities of novels and other continuous texts is that you get repetitions of very important and key vocabulary. I've been involved in development of various word lists, which have informed not only research, but I think to some extent teaching practice. We see word lists working their way into college English classrooms, for example. At some stage, I think everybody in my field needs to start handing over the baton. So since 2009, I've been involved in training and bringing research students up to speed in second language vocabulary research through my doctoral and master's research students. And more recently, in 2021, with the publication offer from the University of Michigan Press, I put together vocabulary and quite a lot of experience, almost 25 years of language teaching in the classroom, putting together vocabulary and second language writing. One of the first things that I was aware of in approaching the book is that vocabulary, I think, has been more associated possibly with the reading teacher than the writing teacher. And this is very much reflected also in research. So what it really meant is it was in some respects an under-researched area, and it created some challenges in terms of addressing what the reviewers wanted in the book, and that was best practice, a how-to-do list of approaching vocabulary through the lens of second language writing. But in early discussions about the webinar, I think I was drawn to focusing on chapter 5 as an approach to this particular book, this webinar. Chapter 5 was the first one that I wrote. I think it is the chapter where we see the closest interface between vocabulary research and second language writing practice, trying to bring the two things together. And when I was thinking about chapter 5 and encouraging and improving productive use of words, I thought about my children, as Estella indicated, grown children. Both of them are conversant in 3 languages, and they're able to read and write, so they've got the literacy development there. I was reflecting on myself, and I think of myself as a bilingual because in a lot of respects, I do operate very well in 2 languages. That applies to speaking, to reading, and to listening. But when it comes to writing, I'm a monolingual in English, and I've been aware of this for a long time. And I think the fact that writing hasn't developed in the same way as the other areas of language for me in my second language is probably a reflection of the specific needs of literacy development. And that's probably why we have these college English and college writing programs around the world, sometimes quite separate from the other aspects of the syllabus, or sometimes integrated more with reading, to address the particular needs of writing development. So in chapter 5, where we're talking about encouraging and improving productive use of words, I think what we're trying to say here is that sometimes receptive vocabularies go well ahead of productive vocabularies. In other words, the exposure to language is not always reflected in writing output. So in the book, I talk a little bit about untapped words. It's quite well recognized by vocabulary researchers, Bartia Lofer, University of Haifa, Paul Nation, Victoria University, where I did my research, and other researchers have been aware of this for quite some time, that receptive vocabulary, the ability to recognize and make links between form and meaning, goes well ahead of writing. And it's a shame because these words can add detail, complexity, specificity, and color to writing. I think we start to get more sophisticated writing as we move into large vocabularies. So the problem is there appears to be some sort of plateauing effect. In other words, at the very early stages, we do see receptive vocabularies translate into writing with very elementary learners. But as we start getting into very advanced learners, I think there is this plateauing effect where there's a tendency for students to use the words that they're most familiar with. And we get a slowdown in writing development. And it's an issue. It's quite well recognized. So really, chapter 5 was trying to address the challenge for writing teachers, which is to promote student use of their full lexicon in writing to suit the writing task and the context. Now, I'm not sure within the system whether we can see chats. I'm just going to pull up a chat and see if I can put something in here. So I'm just going to write in the word English and see whether this comes through. So I've put in the chat English. What I'm wondering is, I think we've got a small group of participants here, but I would imagine most, if not all of you, are what I would regard as mature multilingual writers. You're probably more effective than me in using languages to write. What I'm wondering is, within this group, apart from English, which I've claimed rights to, what other languages are you, as participants here, competent in writing? You can just add to the chat list here, and it'll be interesting just to have a look at this as we go. I live in a particularly multilingual part of the world. In my neighborhood, I hear multiple languages in the morning, people greeting each other. I think children are exposed to quite a host of languages here. But I think I showed you very early on in this presentation the linguistic map of Australia. So 250, possibly 400 Indigenous languages in Australia. Very few of those are robust. There's a small number that have received attention. But what we're finding here is there's a lot of attention, a lot of attraction towards languages with very robust populations of tens of millions, maybe even hundreds of millions. When I'm looking at the list and it's gradually populating here, we're seeing these. And we're not only talking about academic writing. No, this could be any forms of writing. One of the interesting things about this book, and the book that I wrote appears in the Michigan series on teaching multilingual writers. There was a very strong intention to have a focus on different levels of education. So there is attention to elementary, secondary, high school, tertiary settings, academic, and also, of course, in non-academic settings, what I would regard as occupational uses of English and so on. English for aviation, for example, gets a mention in the book, and it's an area where one of my colleagues, John Reid, who's now at the University of Auckland, has been working with professionals in the field. So we really open this book up to a whole host of contexts, different levels, different uses of writing, different educational settings. So if the challenge for writing teachers is to promote student use of their full lexicon, of course, we've got two issues going on here. And one is, to what extent does a writing teacher focus on enlarging our vocabulary? Remember, vocabulary has traditionally been more associated with the reading teacher than the writing teacher. But if we see in classrooms where reading and writing are combined, then of course that makes things a little bit easier. But I think the writing teacher is definitely tasked with encouraging students to tap into words that they may be familiar with. They may have a partial understanding of words, but the idea that with practice, these words could start to be activated much more freely and with a lot more competence in their writing. So thank you for those chats. And as I said, my children have been much more successful than me in this regard. Which really brings me to the issue that not all words are equal. Now, Paul Nation at the University of Sydney with a number of colleagues were tasked with estimating the number of words in the English language. So at the top of the list, the word the, we know, occurs most frequently in most texts. So if you think about even simple nursery rhymes, or you want to check this little piece of theory at the end of this webinar and open a newspaper or a website, it doesn't always occur every seventh, but it is an average across a corpus. So if we go to a corpus of 1 million words or even 100 million words, we've got corpora spanning that large, and I'll talk a little bit about corpora a little bit later. We can start to see some of the most frequently occurring words in the language and also how often they occur. So followed by the, we've got some other function words, articles, prepositions, pronouns, so of, in, at, also very, very common in the language, because in some ways, because we're calling these function words, they're performing a very important structural component within the language. So Paul Nation and his colleagues estimated that there were roughly 123,000 different words within the English language. It does include some archaic words, words that are not widely used. Now, this is a count of words as word families. So if we take the word succeed, succeed, succeeding, success, successful, unsuccessful. All of these we would regard from a language teaching and learning point of view as part of the same family. New versions of the word, so new members of the family, don't necessarily create the same learning demands as would an entirely new word. So if we've got 123,000 words in the language, within the group here, I'm wondering, do you have your own estimates of how many words you know, how many words you use? What percentage of these 123,000? So maybe in thousands, would you like to just put in here? And I don't think it's a time to be modest. It's quite useful. I asked my students here in Sydney this question and get some quite interesting answers within the class. Roughly how many thousand words would you think that you're familiar with and are able to use in writing? And it'll be interesting to see what comes up in the chat. Paul Nation and his team were interested in this question, so had a look at competent users of English in New Zealand, so students who are in their first year of university. And they found out that these what would be regarded as sophisticated users of English knew roughly 20,000 words. And the issue here is 20,000 words for a 20-year-old roughly equates to about 1,000 words acquired every year, or possibly 2 to 3 words acquired every day. So it is for a native speaker quite a slow but sure process. In other words, the focus is partly on the number of words, the quantity, what we talk about breadth, but it's also about depth. In other words, developing a very good and sophisticated knowledge. In the case of second language learners, some of them may not be keen to wait 20 years to develop the vocabulary size they need, and they may not need 20,000 words in order to operate. So one of the areas that's been looked at is, can second language learners operate with a smaller vocabulary? Are there some words that are really not essential or critical, and are there some words that are absolutely central? And the research is mainly focused on words that we can't do without, so categorized as the first 2,000 words of English. The first 1,000, which includes the, of, in, at, and quite a lot of other function and content words, represents roughly 70 to 75% of running words in a corpus. If we add another 1,000 words to this, we only get 4 to 6% coverage. So in other words, as we move from the word the down towards the 2,000th most frequently occurring word, frequency drops drastically. So what it means is the return for effort is starting to drop. And beyond 2,000 words, there is a lot of doubt about the value of going through a dictionary and instructing your students to learn every word on the page, starting with A and ending with Z, because there is a general sense that some of these words are really very unlikely to be met and very unlikely to be used. So beyond 2,000 words, the focus has increasingly been on specialized words. We've got science words, as I talked about, aviation vocabulary, academic words. Various academic word lists have been presented and developed over the years. You can have words for tourism, medical word lists, engineering word lists, and so on. With computer technology now, students could potentially construct their own word list if they were given a little bit of training in how to do this. And teams from various universities around the world actually make it their business sometimes to travel around the world as academics, trying to encourage students to become their own learners, specialized learners. In other words, to create word lists that would inform their own writing development. Now, some of these words are technical, but specialized to a particular field, so aviation, medicine, engineering, but others are what I would regard as sub-technical, or within this category, we've got academic. So while a technical word would occur much more frequently in one particular field, so the aviation words appear there, but not so much in medicine and engineering, sub-technical words, including academic words, in some ways what we call a subject independent. So when we look at some academic words, so we've got, for example, method and data, and the word domestic, which is an academic word, we can't really get a sense of the subject matter, because in some ways, you know, methodologies and data and domestic things can occur in a whole host of subject areas. So what we're really saying is we've got specialization in quite a number of areas. And the idea that not all words are equal has really underpinned a lot of vocabulary teaching, particularly with reading, but also gradually working its way into the writing classroom. So I am checking the chat box as I go. And how many words might I know? In reality, when Paul Nation and his colleagues were estimating, they used a very rough measure of 20,000. My belief is beyond 20,000, we all have specialized areas that reflect our own activities and interest. So if you are a car mechanic, there are words to do with the engine and mechanical parts that you know very well. People in medicine may be familiar with a whole host of drugs and parts of the body and medical procedures and so on. So I think possibly 30,000 is quite a good reflection, building on the basic knowledge of 20,000 into specialized areas of interest. Within sports, I'm interested in seeing local sports. When I go to Japan, I like sumo wrestling. There's a vocabulary with sumo wrestling that you wouldn't really use outside of that field. So we are in some ways getting a picture. Second language writers, though, may be able to operate with a much smaller vocabulary. And there have been suggestions of somewhere between maybe 4,000 and 6,000, if the right words are chosen, would enable quite sophisticated use of English. So we'll talk a little bit about that if we've got time towards the end and how that works. I'm keeping an eye on the time because it might be nice at the very end just to open up for a little bit of question and answer. The main focus then of chapter 5 was promoting activation of vocabulary in writing on the assumption that a lot of words are ready to be activated, and in some ways there might just be a threshold that needs to be reached to enable students to have the confidence and the willingness to try out a word in a writing context. So this is what we call movement of receptive knowledge words from partial to precise. As the meaning becomes more precise, as confidence increases, we're going to see more activation. It also is a promotion of depth of vocabulary knowledge. So I've been talking a lot about vocabulary size. So size is really more about quantity, not quality. We could say, I know 20,000 words or 30,000 words, or second language writers may be able to operate with 4,000 or 5,000 or 6,000 words. But another issue is how well do they know these words? What's the depth of vocabulary knowledge? How well linked are the words to other words in the mental lexicon? And the idea of the depth dimension is that although form meaning relationships are at the core of vocabulary knowledge, so being able to generate a meaning when we see a word form, in other words, the spelling, that's really important. There's also, within the depth dimension, other dimensions that seem to be very important, relationships between words. So if we think about synonyms, what are the synonyms of make? You know, we've got make and construct and lots of other synonyms in that area. But all of these words take on a slightly different meaning. So if we think, for example, about creating, producing, constructing, generating, assembling, we could say, for example, you can generate electricity, hydrogen, and power, but you don't really generate a plate of spaghetti. You'd probably make one. In the same way that hydroelectric dams can generate electricity, but we wouldn't say they make electricity. So one of the things about depth of knowledge is having quite a good understanding of synonyms, antonyms, collocations, how words relate to other words that we already know within the syllabus. We see this with young children. They start to get introduced to quite sophisticated terminology that works for them, fruits, mammals, and so on. Their early understanding of mammals may be mainly terrestrial or land animals. And then one day, could be a visit to an aquarium or reading a book or a conversation or through media, they understand there's also aquatic mammals and they feel enriched and challenged a little bit by this, and they update their understanding of the word mammal. And in life, through our different experiences, we gradually create more complex and sophisticated understandings of words. So I think there's been an increasing knowledge because of people like John Reed and others investigating depth, dimension, increasing interest in how this relates to activation. So I was very lucky to have Birgit Henriksen with me in the University of Sydney, I think for three months. She was our visiting scholar. She's really been at the forefront of talking about different dimensions of vocabulary. And I think it's really an interesting place to start thinking about what that means for writing. So I worked as a teacher, but also was doing a lot of my research at Victoria University Wellington. It's a place where there is quite a cluster of people doing vocabulary research, but it also attracts a lot of visiting scholars. And in the years that I was there on 2 periods, I became aware of quite a lot of research that was focusing on particular interest in how to activate vocabulary use in writing. And 3 key themes started to come through and really consolidated with research. The first one was that if you notice keywords during reading with textual effects to enhance noticing, and we'll have a look at some of those could be, there's more likelihood of these words appearing later in writing. So if you think about a classroom where you've got reading and writing happening, how can we enhance noticing of keywords? Well, what would these keywords be? If you're doing writing, and we just had a little bit of discussion earlier about, are we talking about academic or non-academic context? It could be anything, but if the classroom is English for engineering, and there's engineering terms that are very important, then I think you would typically be introducing students to a text that has engineering words that are important, technical words, and these could be highlighted. They could be highlighted with a highlighter in the text, they could be underlined, they could be in bold, they could be provided with the glossary at the bottom. But any different forms of textual effect seems to enhance production later on, and it might be quite an effective way of actually starting to see transfer into writing. It doesn't seem to be enough though, because if we are encouraging our students to notice words, we also really want to have some sort of deep processing of these words at the time of meeting. And research on deep processing, and we've got depth of processing hypotheses that Birgit Henriksen and others have been very interested in, suggests that if you can have a really deep understanding of word form and meaning, and maybe start introducing other dimensions such as collocations and have students actually try to write these words, you're going to, again, increase the opportunity or the likelihood of words transferring their way from the input, the reading that these students are getting in the classroom, into subsequent writing. But the last one, so Jonathan Newton and a few other researchers have done some empirical work on this area. Pushed output seems to be really important. I think of Meryl Swain, who was doing her research with bilingual students and seeing how if we were just exposing bilinguals to lots of comprehensible input, and we think of Stephen Krashen here, that's wonderful. There's still a lot of interest in the value of comprehensible input, exposing students as much as possible to the language that's going to be important. But Meryl Swain found out that if we also get these students as much as possible actually producing text, writing, forcing them or encouraging them to write, we're going to see improvements in bilingualism. And Jonathan Newton and other researchers in quite controlled studies have found out that if we've got a reading text, and we ask them then to do a piece of writing, and we do it in a controlled way where we put at the top of the page, as Avril Cox said and others have done, write a paragraph on electrolysis to create hydrogen, or conservation of the environment, or how the service sector operates in a hotel, whatever the topic is. If we ask students to do some writing on the topic and we put some keywords at the top, that's encouraging them to use these words. In fact, we could require it at the task. And as they've used each word, they tick it off. If we start this process of controlled writing, what we call pushed output, we're more likely in subsequent writing, where they're not pushed, where it's much more likely to see these words appearing. So these three conditions seem to stand out, and behind all of them is another condition, which is repetition. In other words, if they're noticing words, then you ask them to focus on these words very deeply, then you ask them to use them in their writing. We're getting repeated meetings of the word. And studies have suggested that even if it's just reading, if students come across a new word 10 times, particularly if it's in different contexts, very, very likely for this word to be absorbed or internalized in the mental lexicon. And I think once it's there, it's quite easy for this word to be activated. So we are starting to get some guidelines, which is what the reviewers wanted, some guidelines to inform teachers. Now, how teachers work with this is going to be partly up to their own attitudes or values or experiences. But it does bring us to, I think, a very interesting part, and this reflects my own interest in the book, and that is the reading-writing connection. I started as a language teacher. Well, I did some of my training in the 1980s. So I was put into a language classroom, and I remember I was told, okay, I'm the writing teacher and someone else is going to be the reading teacher. And I asked in this program that was preparing students for tertiary study. So they were in a non-English speaking country, hopefully going to be gaining admission into good universities around the world in a host of English speaking countries. My question was, is there a connection between reading and writing? And in the 1980s, I think there was still some differing views about different approaches to language teaching and what's the best way. I think we've always been experimental. And that's why possibly in TESOL, we see the pendulum swinging quite a bit left and right. But I was the writing teacher and was frustrated that I couldn't actually get access to some of the reading texts, which is why a little bit later when I joined the English Language Institute at the University of Victoria in Wellington, I was pleased that the approach there was holistic. In other words, language was dealt in its entirety with listening, reading, writing, and speaking, and quite a lot of movement between a focus on language, which is what we talked about at the very beginning when Estella was introducing this talk, focus on language and a focus on meaning, and the idea that we can move back and forwards quite fluidly between these. So in a reading-writing connection, I think it's probably the cornerstone of effective vocabulary development in writing. We've got a context and a framework for activation of known or newly acquired words in writing. So these could be what I call key or target words. They could be identified by a learner, so they could do a little needs analysis of themselves. What vocabulary do they need in the future? They could have a look at some examples of prototypes of sort of texts that they'll be needing, and what words do they already know, and therefore there can be a language gap that they want to address. And therefore, they could be exposed to texts where some of the key words are highlighted to encourage what we call noticing words and getting the attention. You can also have an independent vocabulary learning log operating. So the idea of an independent vocabulary learning log is that students in their own time, this is building on work by Sarah Cotterill and David Crabb and others who are very interested in autonomous language learning. The idea that language learning happens very well in the classroom, but the classroom is not occupying enough of the day, particularly in a foreign language environment. You know, second language environments are a little bit more conducive to language learning, but in a foreign language learning environment, if we can take language learning outside of the classroom, I think we maximize opportunities. And one of the ways that we can do this is through independent vocabulary learning logs, where students come across words in the classroom, make a list of them, go home, and in a book, in a little log or sort of a diary type of form, put down each word and put down its form, spelling, and put down the meaning, and maybe put down collocations of the word. So if we've got the word domestic, what does domestic collocate with? Do we have domestic airports, domestic trade, domestic animals, or do we say domesticated? Unfortunately, We've also got domestic violence and disputes. So we've got domestic coming up in quite a host of academic and non-academic contexts. They could also, in their log, actually try using the word in a sentence. So what we call controlled writing, where they put in what they would regard as a prototype example of the word. And it could be through use of a dictionary. And again, that's building on what happens in the reading activity. Writing tasks introduced by the teacher. They could start from quite controlled. So again, the teacher could just ask them to write a sentence with a word. So it could be like a little sheet that's handed out, a series of words on the left, and students are asked to have a go trying to create sentences with the word. But this could move more into paragraphs where they're given a task to write maybe 80 to 100 words, and we could have the vocabulary at the top. And eventually we would try to get what we regard as free writing, where students are actually starting to use these words from their own choice without prompting. And this is what's really supposed to be happening in a reading-writing connection. Central along the way, and this is quite well understood, is feedback on target words. So although not all writing needs to be checked, there is some evidence that if students write journals and the teacher sort of responds as an interested reader but doesn't correct everything, that has benefits, sort of builds up fluency. But we also need to think about accuracy. And students value, we know, and teachers seem to also value the opportunity to provide feedback on words, to correct, in other words, to make small changes, to improve spelling, to make corrections with grammar, to maybe provide more appropriate collocations and so on. And all of this can happen in the reading-writing connection. Part of the book that I put together looks at technology. So although we are starting with chapter 5 here, we're actually starting to go out into other areas and other dimensions of the book. And one of the areas that I've been particularly aware of is, and it happens, I think, particularly with doctoral students we see, is that highly autonomous students, highly autonomous writers, often tap into technology as a way to inform their vocabulary development. So if they're very intent in what I would regard as perfecting their language, so we're talking really at the very high ends, people who want to become very, very sophisticated multilingual writers, sometimes the need to take learning into their own hands. The classroom doesn't really cater well. It's too general, too broad. So we do now have, for example, corpora out there, the Corpus of Contemporary American English. We've got the British National Corpus. So some of these corpora are not in the millions, but we've got hundreds of millions of lexical items there, all representing what we would regard as models of English, very effective models. Students can go in, and they often don't need to be concerned about viruses or get out the credit card. These are all freely available. Could generate, for example, concordance tables of words that they want to use, just to get a glimpse of how experts in the field are using these words. So this could aid in consolidating form-meaning relationships. They can see how the form works, they can see collocations. It will help them to actually develop what we regard as depth of vocabulary knowledge. So as we go down this list here on effect, and this is not particularly tailored to any part of a corpus. So you could, for example, say, I only want to look at scholarly writing. I only want to look at newspapers. I only want to look at writing by a particular group of people or whatever. But if we open things up, we can see noticeable effects, no effects, significant effects, little effects, significance coming up twice. So maybe there's a suggestion here that significant effect collocate quite well. And you can actually, in different parts of corpora, get a ranking of the most commonly occurring clusters of words. So words that just appear to occur together. It's just based on frequency. And based on that, we could say, okay, there seems to be a higher likelihood of these two words occurring together than would naturally occur in the language. And that's really the basis of a collocation, that they're much more likely to occur together than would be other words. We talk about strong coffee. They tend to collocate quite well. But if you put other adjectives with coffee, it doesn't quite work as well. So again, it's partly then collocations reflecting the way people start to use the language and the way people start to introduce words in their own writing. So what I think very advanced students, but probably all the way through, are very keen to do is look at native speakers, very sophisticated users, as a model of language use, and try to some way approximate those students as much as possible, or those writers. I did suggest at the beginning of the talk that we're not only talking about vocabulary and second language writing here, but we're also talking about a changing field of TESOL. And one of the reasons for this is during my term as a second language teacher, and particularly as a writing teacher, because I was drawn to teaching writing at a very early stage, I noticed that there were changes within the field of second language writing and TESOL. I'm an applied linguist, a TESOL academic and teacher. So I've seen some of these changes, and I think it's probably a reflection of fashion and what's popular and what's fashionable in the field of TESOL. One of these relates to how we deal with a multitude of languages in our classroom. So I know in the 1980s, I was told in my language class, please, the English language classroom is an English-only environment. So in some ways, I was almost taught to regard my students as monolinguals. In other words, they only know English. And although some of them didn't know very much English at all, depending on the level, I wasn't really encouraged to think of them as proficient in other languages or to tap into that. So barriers seem to be put up between the languages. If my students started using Japanese or Korean or Thai or other languages, I would rush to the door and close it because I was in fear of breaking the rules within the institute. A few years later, the fashion seemed to change, and there was a lot more tolerance of different languages being used, but we wouldn't really see that appearing in writing. But I do teach a course here at the University of Sydney in the Master of Education called Bilingual Education, late on a Monday evening. And one of the things that I show them and might show my students in class is a bilingual class, a science class in the United States. They're learning about conservation, and the students in the class are roughly 50% native speakers of Spanish and 50% native speakers of English, but it's a bilingual program. So dual language instruction, 2 teachers in the classroom, both teachers are bilingual, but one teacher is much more interested in the Spanish dimension of the class and another much more interested in English, but they're also both science teachers. So it's really a lovely environment. Dual language programs where you've got 50-50 division between the students and teachers are really what we regard as strong or effective bilingual programs. And in that classroom, the teachers not only were interested in the languages of their students and aware of them, but they actually utilized that as a key component of writing development. So if the focus was on writing development in English, one of the pathways into English for those students was the knowledge they already have, very well-developed knowledge for 50% of the students in Spanish. So in other words, there can be a positive transfer from literacy in Spanish to English and vice versa. So there is, I think, a gradual embracing now of what we regard as the full linguistic repertoire of students. Lord Ortega talked 10 years ago about a bilingual or multilingual turn in TESOL. I think we're still seeing that happening at the moment, a little bit of resistance in pockets, but it does allow language development to reflect the learner, their languages, their view of themselves, their aspirations. I work with a group of researchers at Mahidol University in Salaya in Thailand, and one of their pet programs, it's a language revitalization unit. One of their pet programs is in the south of Thailand, where you've got students who have a local Malay language called Patani Malay. That's the language they have in the home. They're also exposed to Thai language in the community, part of Thailand, the national language. Increasingly, they're exposed to English through various contexts, tourism, advertising, their parents and so on, their teachers. So in the program in Patani Malay, in the south of Thailand, one of the experimental projects there is to allow students, and this is focused on literacy development, to first develop literacy skills, so writing capacity in the language they know best, which is Patani Malay. And they do this for the first few years of schooling. No other languages are introduced at all. And this was negotiated with the Thai Ministry of Education. Then the next most important language is introduced, which is the Thai language, possibly grade 3 or 4, but Patani Malay literacy development continues, and gradually Thai language is introduced. And it's a little bit behind Patani Malay, but with time it will catch up. And a few years later, English is introduced. So at some point later on, once students are entering high school, they've actually got 3 languages being developed. Now, it does have an impact. So possibly there is a recognition that if you expose learners to a lot of languages when they're young, it may slow down the development. It's sort of like learning to cook a lot of dishes at the same time. But by the time they finish high school, they've caught up and actually got some wonderful resources that they're going to use in the future. And it seems to have positive impacts not only on language, but also on non-linguistic areas of their learning, including mathematics. I mean, this has been shown in research. So language development seems to help us in a whole host of our lifetime activities. So what does it mean for us? I assume we're all language teachers or researchers. It's got implications. If we've got multilingual students, we need to make a choice. How much do we want to learn about our students? How much do we want to ask them about the languages they know and how well they write in those languages? And if we are going to have that information known, and it's not always just 2 languages in the classroom, it could be quite a lot. One of the issues then, and it's a challenge for a writing teacher, is how are they going to respond to that knowledge? How are they going to utilize that when it comes to writing development? And it does in some ways change the whole way we're doing things. But as I say, the research is starting to suggest that there can be very positive transfer if students are allowed the opportunity at a very early age to develop literacy in the language from the home before introducing some of the new languages. So it opens up possibilities for translanguaging in the bilingual classroom to aid in vocabulary development. What is translanguaging? How would we describe it? Some of you might be familiar with code shifting, where students might change from one language to another. But code switching suggests that there are actually barriers assembled between languages. We sort of close one and open another. In translanguaging, I think the movement between languages is a lot more fluid. It's a lot more relaxed. And in a translanguaging classroom, actually students are moving in and out of languages, in some ways accessing their full linguistic repertoire. But where the research needs to catch up is, how does this impact on writing development? And in some ways, we're still at early days in this area. So I've really covered quite a few topics, and I did say I'd leave a little bit of time at the end, a couple of references here. I'm very happy to open this up for questions and comments. I can also share some of these resources with Estella to pass on to the group at the end. So thank you for listening. I was thinking about ways to interact. If it's a lecture in the classroom, I often walk around with the microphone, which is a lot easier. Webinars I find challenging in this regard, but I'm very keen to have comments and questions from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David, for this informative and thought-provoking talk. I'm glad you're willing to share the presentation. I will also share the recording of the talk when it's done processing. It will be posted on the TESOL YouTube channel. So I'm buying people time so they can formulate some questions for you. I'm sure their brains are very stimulated with all this information and interesting topics you presented on.
I'll go with one if that's okay. Hey, Keith Fultz in Orlando, Florida, where it's hot and muggy already, shockingly. I have a question for you. So, as someone who's taught for forever and a day, I missed the very beginning. I apologize. It's a crazy day here. I also teach Monday nights and had some papers to deal with some students in a web course. My question is, you mentioned in the last slide of translanguaging, and I know this is not a very popular view, but I'm old and can say whatever I want. It's just you said the magic word. I'm not dissing translanguaging. I'm certainly not dissing students using their L1. In the second language vocabulary research that I'm really familiar with and interested in is from 2004 with my book Vocabulary Myths. I have advocated the use of L1 with learning vocabulary. This is ridiculous to pretend that 30 human beings in a classroom have no first language. That's why they're there. But you're right. That's what we were told. And God forbid your supervisor heard that you were letting people speak not English in class. But with vocabulary research, there's a lot of going back to the power of L1, power of your first language. So I have no problem with that. But you used the magic word. You said something like trendy. And that is the word, I think. And that's what scares me about when I hear people talk about translanguaging. And I am by no means a bilingual classroom expert, but I have gone to read the original Garcia, Ophelia Garcia, and reading this research. And this is, to me, this was not an ESL classroom the way that most TESOL people know. Most TESOL people know you're in an intensive course and they're from all over the world and they pay big money to be able to write an essay or research paper pretty quickly. Well, quickly being a relative term, is it not? But I appreciate when you said the word trendy. When you said it, I thought, yeah, because I go to a conference and I hear so many people talk about this, and I think, wait, you were the ones that were advocating English only, and I didn't think you knew what you were talking about then, and I don't think you know what you're talking about now. But all this is to situate my question, which is, I remember early on some of the research in early L2 writing, when the Journal of Second Language Writing was just getting started, that there were studies of where, and I don't remember the results, I wish I could pull this out of the top of my head as I can't a vocabulary study, but where some students wrote their essays in English, did their first draft, second draft, whatever, and then in some of those experimental studies, some students were allowed to write their first draft in L1. And then it's what we would call a Google Translate today, but they had to translate it using something called a dictionary, and your skills of, student skills. Are you familiar with, or is anyone familiar with some of the results of those studies? I mean, I also want to say that those studies probably showed that L1 all the time was the best, but then also we have to think about that journals published what you don't get to publish something that's controversial too often. I guess what I'm asking is, do you or anyone know or can remember some of these studies where students were allowed the traditional write your thing in English versus those who wrote they wrote it in Spanish and then somehow produced an English version?
So yeah, if you go to Garcia, he's continuing. There's still a lot of research just being done just in the last few years, and I think possibly there might be some answers there. If anyone's got the answer, put up their hand. But my first response, Keith, is that I think we're starting to see two different fields here. We've got those who are much more interested in multilingualism, plurilingualism, bilingual education, and so on, particularly if we think about a Canadian context where you've got government policy and opportunities for jobs, which are really necessitating more than one language. I think a lot of research coming out of there has probably been transferred into a TESOL context, but not very comfortably. And I think we're probably seeing that translanguaging fits very well into what I talked about, that lovely bilingual education classroom, dual language instruction, because the goal there is literacy and language and identity development in more than one language. That's how they're being assessed. That's the task. I think in TESOL, and you can see it in the name, we're not going to really be assessed on how well students maintained or further developed their home or heritage language. So I think one of the issues for TESOL is, can we accommodate some of these interests that are working their way into TESOL from bilingual education, as Lord Sortiga talked about, a bilingual turn, as well as attending to what our students and maybe the administrators and definitely the testing centers will be interested in, and that is how well you can produce a piece of writing in a TOEFL or an IELTS test and so on. And this is always going to be a challenge. My own instincts in years of teaching is that parents, through their children, are often encouraging an English-only environment for their students because they think this is going to be the best way. So I don't have the answers to the research. I think it's really interesting research, but I think it is a challenge. So trendy is the word. I've seen the pendulum shift. You and I have been around long enough to see it go back and forwards. My concern is, will we continue to be subject to this in the future? And it troubles me because I like this idea of a post-method pedagogy, where we no longer dictate to the world how to teach, but we think about what's going to suit our learners well, what's the classroom we've got here, what are their goals, and how do I like teaching writing from my own experience? So this is probably what's going to work well into the future.
Yeah, thanks. Great answer.
Thank you, Keith. Very interesting.
I will find those results because I myself want to know this now, because at the time it was interesting, but now I may need defense. I need to know what these things said.
Time passes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
You're welcome. Lovely to see you.
Thank you. Let's see if there's maybe one more question.
I have kind of maybe a much more simpler question. I teach graduate students at Duke University, and of course they come from a range of fields, and so I can't do that reading, writing connection. So I'm always trying to think about, well, how can I support them in their vocabulary progress? And the question that keeps coming to my mind recently is, okay, when I give them feedback and they use a word that I'm like, I think you mean this word, or I feel like I know what they're trying to say, but I can facilitate a smoother, phrasing. I usually say, try this, or do you mean this? And I'm just wondering what your thought is as far as like supplying the word versus making them work for it a little bit harder.
So I think it would be right to say our learners are often in a hurry. I think Keith touched on this a little bit earlier. So anything that's going to increase the opportunity to access words, and of course your students look to you as a model of language use, I think they're expecting you to perform that role. I don't think you're ever going to create any difficulties along the way. My own sense is in the classroom it's quite useful to move back and forwards between a focus on meaning, so generating ideas, what's the topic, what's the key ideas, what's the interest, and then from time to time looking at language. And the idea of moving back and forwards between a meaning-focused and a language-focused classroom means that there's no rules there. You can stop the class for a minute in the middle of writing, get onto the board, and let's just have a look at how this word is used. I've seen quite a few of you are trying to use it in your writing, some more effective than others. My job as a language teacher is to make sure that you use it as effectively as possible. Let's share ideas. Now, do you generate ideas from the learners? And this is getting into the whole area of inductive and deductive learning. So I quite like the idea of creating quite demanding situations for learning at the pass. And I think this is what you're touching on. Do you get the students to work hard? I like the idea of that. But you need to realize at what point do you need to also step in to facilitate really quick learning? And I think the answer is we need to be quite ambidextrous in the classroom and never be frightened that we're doing something wrong. But in reality, the students will want the answer at some point, or definitely want assurance or affirmation that what they're doing works well for you. We don't want compassionate passes in the classroom when it comes to writing. That doesn't work. And I think we've had generations possibly in the 80s and 90s, that were told too often that they were doing a great job in their writing, and in fact they weren't. Students really do need to know about accuracy, and I think it's critical. And I've never turned my back on an opportunity to steer students in the right direction. But how we do it, as you suggest, is up to us as language teachers. Lots of ways to do that.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Fantastic. So I feel like we have a lot of questions, but I want to be respectful of your time. We said this is going to last an hour, and we've gone a little bit over 7 p.m. Eastern time here. So I just want to say again, thank you very much for such a high quality, professional and interesting talk. Thank you everyone for showing up. Look forward to the, or look out for the recording, and please share the recording as widely as possible when you receive it. Share it with your students and colleagues. And I think if you have more questions and would like to see David again, he is giving another talk soon, right? I can remember, I think it was for the CGC group. David, are you?
Look, I have to check on that one. I probably am, but I need to go and check. But in any case, I will be around in various places. And there are lots of other professionals, including Keith and others, who are doing wonderful work in the area. So it's really a matter of finding opportunities to engage in these really interesting discussions.
Absolutely.
So yes, I'll be very happy to talk more of these opportunities in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. And with that, goodbye, everybody.
Lovely.
Thanks.
Good night.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye. Thank you.